The packed auditorium fell completely silent as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone, her expression resolute and focused. Moments earlier, Dr. Ben Carson had dismissed her line of questioning with a condescending wave of his hand, stating, "Congresswoman, with all due respect, these housing policy questions reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of basic economics." His dismissal had sent ripples of tension through the crowd at the congressional oversight hearing on housing and urban development. Crockett's eyes narrowed slightly as she opened a leather portfolio containing documents that Carson couldn't see. "Dr. Carson," she began, her voice measured and precise, "before you dismiss my questions as reflecting a fundamental misunderstanding, perhaps you should explain why the data from your own department directly contradicts the testimony you've provided to this committee today." She held up a document bearing the HUD letterhead that nobody, especially Carson, had anticipated. The room erupted in gasps and whispers as Carson's confident smile vanished. This wasn't just another congressional hearing exchange. It was the defining moment when Jasmine Crockett turned what seemed like a political defeat into a powerful demonstration of preparedness and accountability. If you're watching this video, hit the like button and subscribe now to ensure you never miss our next dramatic political confrontation. To fully appreciate the significance of this confrontation, one must understand the backgrounds of these two formidable individuals and the context that brought them face to face in this high-stakes environment. Dr. Ben Carson had built his reputation as one of the world's most renowned neurosurgeons before transitioning to politics and public service. His inspiring journey from poverty to the pinnacle of medicine had made him a household name and respected figure across the political spectrum. After his presidential campaign, his appointment as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development placed him in charge of addressing America's complex housing challenges. Despite lacking specific experience in housing policy, Carson's intelligence and analytical approach had earned him credibility with supporters who valued his outsider perspective on government. At the hearing, Carson projected the calm confidence that had served him well throughout his medical career. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit with a burgundy tie, he responded to questions with the measured demeanor of a surgeon, explaining procedures to colleagues. For the first hour of testimony, his responses to committee questions had been clinical and precise, occasionally referencing his department's data to support policy decisions. His supporters on the committee had provided him with friendly questions that allowed him to elaborate on his vision for housing policy reform. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett brought a different but equally impressive background to this confrontation. The Texas representative had built her reputation as a civil rights attorney before entering politics, representing underserved communities and fighting housing discrimination cases. Her first-hand experience with families facing eviction and housing insecurity informed her approach to policy. Though relatively new to Congress, she had quickly established herself as a meticulous legislator who came to hearings exceptionally well prepared. Crockett had spent the 3 days before the hearing immersed in HUD's own internal reports and data. Her office had filed targeted Freedom of Information Act requests months earlier, receiving documents that contained the department's unfiltered analysis that sometimes contradicted the public narratives. While other committee members relied on staff-prepared questions, Crockett had personally reviewed thousands of pages of material, marking key sections with colored tabs for quick reference during questioning. The oversight hearing itself carried significant weight. Recent policy changes at HUD had reduced funding for several major urban housing initiatives, while reallocating resources to new programs whose effectiveness remained unproven. Housing advocates had raised alarms about increasing homelessness in key metropolitan areas, while Carson's department maintained that their new approach would yield better long-term outcomes. The hearing room reflected these high stakes, packed with housing advocates, industry representatives, and media. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and a line of people waited outside hoping for admission if space became available. In the week leading up to this confrontation, Carson had appeared on several news programs confidently defending his department's policy shifts. "We're moving from dependency-creating programs to opportunity-creating solutions," he had stated repeatedly. Meanwhile, Crockett had avoided media appearances, focusing instead on preparation, a strategy that would soon prove remarkably effective. What made this confrontation particularly noteworthy was that Carson had consistently relied on his considerable intellectual abilities to overcome challenges throughout his career. He was unaccustomed to being contradicted with evidence he couldn't immediately contextualize or explain. Crockett, meanwhile, had built her legal career on meticulous preparation and letting evidence speak for itself, a skill set perfectly suited for congressional oversight. This combination of factors set the stage for a memorable clash that would soon captivate the nation's attention. The hearing room hummed with subdued conversation as Chairman Thompson called the oversight session to order. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the polished wood of the committee dais where members sat behind nameplates identifying their states and districts. Network cameras were positioned strategically around the room, capturing every moment of this consequential hearing on housing and urban development policies. Secretary Carson delivered his opening statement with practiced precision, maintaining steady eye contact with committee members. The traditional approach to housing assistance has trapped too many Americans in dependency, he explained, his hands clasped calmly before him. Our new Pathways to Self-Sufficiency initiative redirects resources from maintenance of substandard housing to programs that create genuine economic opportunity and mobility. Republican members nodded approvingly as Carson continued. The data is clear after decades of the old approach. Poverty remains entrenched in the very communities these programs were meant to help. It's time for transformative change based on evidence rather than ideology. When questioning began, Carson easily fielded inquiries from supportive committee members. Representative Miller from Ohio provided a perfect platform. Secretary Carson, could you elaborate on how your Opportunity Zone initiatives create better outcomes than traditional housing subsidies? Carson relaxed visibly, his response flowing with confidence. The evidence shows that simply subsidizing housing without addressing underlying economic conditions perpetuates cycles of poverty. Our Opportunity Zone approach incentivizes private investment in the very communities where traditional programs have failed. He referenced several statistics supporting his position, occasionally consulting notes prepared by his staff. For nearly an hour, Carson maintained control of the narrative. Even when Democratic members pressed him on funding cuts to specific programs, he pivoted effectively to his broader vision, keeping his responses measured and intellectual. Then came Congresswoman Crockett's turn. She began quietly, establishing context for her line of questioning. Secretary Carson, I'd like to explore the evidence base for recent policy decisions, she stated, her tone respectful but direct. Before redirecting funds from established programs to new initiatives, I assume your department conducted thorough impact analyses. Of course, Congresswoman, Carson replied smoothly. Evidence-based policymaking is the cornerstone of our approach at HUD. We've conducted extensive research showing that our new initiatives will create sustainable pathways out of poverty rather than temporary relief. Crockett nodded, opening her binder. I'm looking at your department's comprehensive housing assessment from March of this year. On page 147, your research team concluded that eliminating the urban revitalization program would likely increase homelessness in 17 major metropolitan areas by 26% within 18 months. Yet your testimony today suggests these changes will improve outcomes. Can you reconcile these contradictions? A flicker of surprise crossed Carson's face, quickly replaced by practiced composure. The report you're referencing examines only short-term projections without accounting for the compensatory effects of our Opportunity Zone investments. I understand that's your position, Crockett responded. However, I'm also looking at the economic projection models your department submitted to the Congressional Budget Office last quarter. She held up another document. According to your department's own analysis, the compensatory effects you reference are projected to take 7 to 9 years to materialize, leaving a substantial gap in services. Would you agree that this creates a serious concern for families facing immediate housing insecurity? Carson's expression tightened slightly. Congresswoman, policy transitions naturally involve adjustment periods. The long-term benefits justify temporary disruptions. Secretary Carson, Crockett continued, your testimony today stated that the Pathways to Opportunity program has shown promising early results in its pilot phase. However, I have here the interim evaluation report prepared by your department last month. She held up another document. It states, and I quote, initial data suggests implementation challenges have prevented meaningful assessment of program efficacy. Preliminary outcomes do not differ significantly from traditional assistance models. This seems to contradict your characterization of promising results, murmurs rippled through the hearing room. Carson's brow furrowed slightly as he glanced toward his staff seated behind him. Those are preliminary findings in an incomplete analysis, Carson responded, his tone growing more defensive. The full implementation will yield different outcomes. Perhaps, Crockett acknowledged, but shouldn't policy changes be based on established evidence rather than anticipated results? Especially when affecting housing security for vulnerable populations? Carson shifted in his chair. Congresswoman, with all due respect, these housing policy questions reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of basic economics. Sometimes, transformative approaches require moving beyond the constraints of existing frameworks. My background has taught me to identify when conventional thinking impedes progress. His dismissal was delivered with the confidence of someone unaccustomed to being challenged effectively. A slight, condescending smile accompanied his response as he waved his hand dismissively. The room tensed at this shift in tone. Chairman Thompson leaned forward slightly, watching the exchange with increased attention. This was the moment the dismissal that would soon circulate widely online. Crockett paused, allowing the dismissal to hang in the air momentarily before responding. "Dr. Carson," she began, her voice measured but carrying clearly through the now silent chamber. "Before you dismiss my questions as reflecting a fundamental misunderstanding, perhaps you should explain why the data from your own department directly contradicts the testimony you've provided to this committee today." She opened another folder, removing a document that she placed on the display stand for all to see. "This is a memorandum from your chief data officer to your office dated just 2 weeks ago. It explicitly warns that, and I quote, public characterizations of program outcomes should be tempered until preliminary data can be validated. Current messaging exceeds what available evidence supports." Gasps and whispers swept through the hearing room. Carson stared at the document, momentarily speechless as he recognized the internal memorandum he had apparently either not seen or chosen to ignore. Crockett continued, her tone remaining professional rather than triumphant. "Additionally, this analysis from your budget office indicates that the reallocation of funds from established programs to new initiatives was implemented, despite objections from your department's own program evaluation team, who cited insufficient evidence of improved outcomes and significant risks to currently housed populations." She placed another document on the display. "Secretary Carson, these aren't external critiques of your policies. These are assessments from your own experts, the very professionals whose expertise should inform HUD's decisions and your testimony to Congress." The room had fallen completely silent. Committee members on both sides of the aisle leaned forward, some examining copies of the documents being distributed by Crockett's staff. Journalists in the press section typed frantically on laptops and phones. Carson adjusted his tie, visibly collecting himself. "Congresswoman, policy development involves many perspectives. These internal deliberations represent just one viewpoint among many that I consider." "Of course," Crockett nodded. "But when you testify to Congress about evidence-based policies and promising results, shouldn't that testimony accurately reflect the evidence your department actually possesses, including when that evidence contradicts your preferred narrative?" She wasn't shouting or grandstanding, her devastating effectiveness came from her calm precision and the irrefutable nature of the evidence she presented. This wasn't political theater, it was accountability in action. "The American people depend on accurate information from government officials," she continued. "Housing policy affects whether families have roofs over their heads or sleep on the streets. It determines whether children have stable environments for development or face constant disruption and trauma. Given these stakes, wouldn't you agree that congressional testimony should reflect the full range of evidence, even when that evidence suggests caution rather than confidence?" The confrontation had reached its critical moment. Carson, the brilliant neurosurgeon and respected public figure, faced a challenge not to his intelligence but to his candor, and the evidence came not from political opponents but from his own department's internal assessments. The silence that followed Crockett's question seemed to stretch into infinity, though it lasted only seconds. Every eye in the hearing room remained fixed on Secretary Carson, who appeared momentarily caught between multiple possible responses. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed noticeably. The dismissive confidence had evaporated, replaced by a more measured, almost conciliatory approach. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, "policy implementation involves balancing numerous factors and perspectives. The memoranda you've highlighted represent important internal discussions that inform our approach. Perhaps my characterization of promising results was more forward-looking than current data strictly supports." This partial concession, rare in congressional hearings, sent a ripple through the room. Journalists glanced at each other, recognizing they were witnessing an unusual moment of accountability. Crockett didn't press her advantage with triumphalism. Instead, she maintained her professional demeanor. "Thank you for that clarification, Secretary Carson. Given this acknowledgement, would you be willing to provide this committee with a revised assessment that more accurately reflects the current evidence regarding both established programs and new initiatives? This would help ensure our oversight responsibilities are fulfilled with complete information." Carson nodded slowly. My department can provide updated documentation that includes the full spectrum of internal analyses and projections. I believe in transparency and would want this committee to have comprehensive information. Chairman Thompson leaned toward his microphone. The committee would appreciate receiving those materials within 2 weeks, Mr. Secretary. Sensing Carson's discomfort, Representative Williams from Georgia attempted to redirect the conversation. If I might interject, Mr. Chairman, Secretary Carson's visionary approach to housing policy shouldn't be undermined by preliminary data points. His broader vision deserves consideration. Crockett didn't need to respond to this intervention. The evidence she had presented spoke for itself. Instead, she continued her methodical questioning. Secretary Carson, the memorandum from your data office also mentions concerns about the geographic distribution of housing resource reallocation. Could you address the assessment that urban communities with higher minority populations will experience disproportionate negative impacts during this transition period? Carson gathered himself, recognizing that dismissive responses would no longer be effective. The geographic impact analysis raises valid concerns that we're addressing through targeted interventions. I would note, however, that the long-term benefits of economic revitalization should ultimately reach all communities. I appreciate that perspective, Crockett responded. But according to your department's timeline analysis, these long-term benefits are projected for the 7 to 9 year time frame, while service reductions are already being implemented. Has your department developed interim measures to address the immediate needs of affected communities? This measured but persistent questioning continued for several more minutes. With each exchange, the dynamic in the room shifted further. Committee members who had been checking phones or reviewing unrelated documents were now fully engaged. Some were requesting copies of the evidence Crockett had introduced. Representative Johnson from Ohio, who had earlier offered Carson friendly questions, now asked more probing follow-ups. Secretary Carson, in light of Congresswoman Crockett's evidence, could you clarify whether the department's public messaging about program effectiveness was approved by your program evaluation team? The atmosphere in the room had transformed. What had begun as a routine oversight hearing with predictable partisan lines had become a tensioner. Substantive examination of evidence and accountability. Crockett had shifted the conversation from ideological positioning to factual assessment. As her questioning time neared its end, Crockett delivered her concluding remarks. Secretary Carson, I want to emphasize that my concerns aren't about your vision or intentions, which I believe are sincere. My concern is ensuring that policy decisions, especially those affecting vulnerable Americans, are truly evidence-based rather than aspiration-driven. Would you commit to incorporating your department's own research findings more explicitly in future policy implementations, even when those findings suggest caution or modification of preferred approaches? Carson, recognizing the reasonableness of this request and aware of the room's shifted dynamics, nodded. Evidence should indeed drive policy, Congresswoman. I commit to ensuring our department's research findings are fully integrated into our decision-making processes and transparently communicated to Congress and the public. This exchange focused on substance rather than political point-scoring drew approving nods from members of both parties. Crockett had achieved something rare in contemporary politics, a moment of genuine accountability focused on evidence rather than partisanship. As she yielded back her time, the committee room buzzed with conversation. Journalists were already filing updates with headlines like "Carson acknowledges HUD overstated program results" and "Crockett's evidence forces policy reassessment." Within minutes, clips of the exchange were circulating on social media, particularly the moment when Carson's dismissal was met with Crockett's evidence-based response. But the significance of this confrontation went beyond the immediate political theater. Crockett had demonstrated that effective oversight doesn't require shouting or personal attacks, just methodical preparation, precise questioning, and an unwavering focus on evidence. In doing so, she had elevated the discourse around housing policy from partisan positioning to substantive evaluation of real-world impacts on vulnerable communities. As the hearing concluded and attendees filed out of the room, the impact of the Carson-Crockett exchange was already reverberating beyond the committee walls. Capitol Hill staffers shared clips of the confrontation on social media, and within hours, the video had garnered millions of views across platforms. The phrase, "her own department's data," became a trending topic as viewers shared their reactions to this rare moment of evidence-based accountability. In the marbled hallway outside, journalists surrounded Congresswoman Crockett, now thrust into a national spotlight that extended far beyond her previous media exposure. Standing composed before a cluster of microphones, she maintained the same measured tone that had served her so effectively during the hearing. Today wasn't about political theater, she explained to the assembled press. It was about ensuring that public policy, especially policy affecting whether Americans have roofs over their heads, is genuinely informed by evidence rather than wishful thinking. Secretary Carson is an accomplished individual with legitimate perspectives on housing policy. My concerns weren't with his vision but with ensuring that vision is tempered by rigorous assessment of real-world impacts. When asked if she had deliberately set a trap for Carson, Crockett's response reflected her professional background. "I didn't come looking for confrontation. I came prepared to have a substantive policy discussion based on complete information. The documents I presented weren't obtained through unusual means, they were HUD's own assessments, available through proper channels. Effective oversight requires doing the homework." Meanwhile, Secretary Carson was engaged in his own media response. Surrounded by a smaller group of reporters, the Secretary attempted to contextualize the exchange. Congresswoman Crockett raised valid points about how we communicate program outcomes. While I stand behind our department's policy direction, I appreciate her emphasis on rigorous evidence assessment. Transformative policy change requires both vision and careful implementation. I believe we can achieve both. Yet, even as he spoke, split-screen coverage on news networks was showing clips of his dismissive comment alongside Crockett's methodical dismantling of his testimony. The visual contrast between his initial condescension and subsequent acknowledgement of her legitimate concerns told a compelling story about preparation and accountability. The afternoon following the hearing, HUD issued a statement announcing the formation of an evidence integration task force to ensure that departmental communications and policy implementations fully reflect the complete range of internal research and assessment. While not explicitly referencing the hearing, the timing made the connection obvious to observers. Within days, the impact extended beyond this specific exchange. Committee chairs from both chambers began requesting similar internal assessment documents from other departments, citing the HUD precedent. Several oversight hearings that had been scheduled as routine checkboxes were suddenly being prepared for with greater rigor as both questioners and witnesses recognized a new standard had been established. For Carson, the exchange wasn't career-ending but required adjustment. In subsequent appearances, he noticeably modified his approach, bringing greater nuance to policy discussions and explicitly acknowledging limitations and challenges alongside opportunities. When questioned about the hearing weeks later, he demonstrated personal growth. Congresswoman Crockett reminded me of something important, that even well-intentioned policies must be guided by rigorous evidence, not just aspirational thinking. That's a principle worth defending, regardless of one's political perspective. Policy experts noted a substantive shift in HUD's approach in the months following the hearing. The department began publishing more comprehensive impact assessments that included potential risks alongside benefits. Program modifications incorporated more explicit transition plans to address short-term disruptions. Several initiatives were adjusted to provide bridge support for communities that would experience temporary service reductions before long-term improvements materialized. For Crockett, the exchange became a defining moment that transcended partisan politics. Her methodical dismantling of misleading testimony earned respect across the political spectrum. Housing policy experts sought her input, committee leadership assigned her to key oversight roles, and her approach became a case study in effective congressional questioning. Most significantly, the confrontation sparked a broader conversation about the broader role of evidence in policymaking. Academic institutions hosted symposia examining the Crockett Standard for Policy Evaluation and Governmental Transparency. A Georgetown Law Review article analyzed the exchange as exemplifying evidence-based oversight in an era of partisan polarization. 3 years later, when Crockett introduced comprehensive legislation on housing stability metrics, Carson, no longer serving in government, agreed to co-chair a bipartisan advisory committee supporting its implementation. Their joint statement noted that, despite different perspectives on government's role, we share a commitment to evidence-based policy that genuinely improves outcomes for vulnerable Americans. This evolution from confrontation to collaboration reflected the highest aspiration of democratic governance, that accountability can lead not just to political point scoring, but to substantive improvement in how government serves its citizens. In political science, classrooms, and public administration programs, the Carson-Crockett exchange became required viewing as an example of how oversight should function. The lesson wasn't about partisan advantage, but about the essential role of evidence in ensuring that government actions align with their stated purposes and serve the public interest effectively. Beyond policy circles, the confrontation resonated with the general public because it demonstrated something increasingly rare in political discourse: that preparation and evidence can prevail over authority and assumption. In an era often characterized by theatrical confrontations and partisan grandstanding, Crockett had shown that the most effective challenge to power comes not from matching its volume, but from methodically exposing the gap between claims and reality. Perhaps most important was the impact on housing policy itself. The increased scrutiny of evidence and outcomes led to more careful program design and implementation. Subsequent assessments showed improved results as aspirational goals became better aligned with practical realities. Communities that might have experienced prolonged disruption during policy transitions received more comprehensive support through improved planning. The Carson-Crockett exchange thus transcended its momentary drama to exemplify how democratic accountability, when functioning properly, improves not just the process of governance but its substantive outcomes. Their confrontation, followed by mutual respect and eventual collaboration, demonstrated that evidence-based oversight serves not to impede progress but to ensure that progress is real rather than merely claimed, a principle that strengthens democratic governance regardless of which party holds power. As we've seen in this pivotal confrontation between Ben Carson and Jasmine Crockett, thorough preparation and unwavering focus on evidence can transform political discourse from theatrical posturing to substantive accountability. If you found value in this analysis, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more insightful examinations of the moments that shape our political landscape. Hit the notification bell to stay informed of our latest uploads. Share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of this exchange do you find most significant for effective governance? We'll see you in our next video.